Hollywood sold wedding photos like fairy tales, satin gowns, flashbulbs, smiling stars. But behind some of those perfect pictures, the marriage may have been less about romance and more about survival. In the studio era, rumors could wreck a contract, morality campaigns could crush a career, and one whisper about a star's private life could trigger panic. So Hollywood built lies. Sometimes elegant lies, sometimes heartbreaking ones. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are right now, today. Rock Hudson and Phyllis Gates. Rock Hudson looked like the studio system's dream of American manhood. He was tall, handsome, rugged, and reassuring all at once. By the mid-1950s, he was no longer just another contract player. He was becoming one of Hollywood's safest romantic investments, the kind of star fan magazines could sell as pure confidence in a tuxedo. Then came the wedding. In 1955, Hudson married Phyllis Gates, a secretary who had worked for his powerful agent, Henry Wilson. On paper, the match looked tidy. The leading man found love. The public got its fairy tale. The headlines got their proof that the screen idol was exactly who the studios wanted him to be. But this story has stayed contested for decades. Many writers, biographers, and later documentaries have treated the marriage as a classic alleged Lavender arrangement, something that helped quiet rumors about Hudson's relationships with men and protect the masculine image that made him profitable. Gates herself pushed back and said she had married for love. That disagreement matters because one person's cover story may have been another person's real hope, and Hollywood had every reason to keep the illusion polished. Hudson's image was valuable. Gossip columnists could damage a star with suggestion alone, and the system around him was built to manage suggestion before it became scandal. A wedding ring in that world could act like armor. The emotional cost came fast. The marriage deteriorated quickly, they separated within a couple of years, and later accounts described hurt, secrecy, and resentment beneath the glossy photographs. That is the part people remember now, not just whether the marriage was arranged, but how many lives were bent around keeping one leading man marketable. Hollywood built lies to protect careers. This may be the case that made that truth impossible to ignore. Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor. Barbara Stanwyck and Robert Taylor looked almost too perfect to question. She was sharp, disciplined, and magnetic. He was one of MGM's most beautiful leading men, the kind of face designed for soft-focus close-ups and studio romance spreads. Together, they gave the public exactly what old Hollywood loved to sell: elegance, glamour, and a marriage that photographed beautifully. But the polished image has long carried a second reading. Their marriage has often been described in Hollywood lore as a union that helped calm gossip and stabilize publicity around two major stars. Some accounts lean harder on the idea of arrangement than others, so the safest way to frame it is this: it became one of those marriages people kept reinterpreting as more strategic than intimate. That is partly because the emotional temperature always seemed hard to read. On the surface, they had status, beauty, and press value. Underneath, biographers and later commentators have described distance, mismatch, and a private life that did not always fit the glamorous package MGM promoted. Even where genuine affection existed, it lived inside a machine that rewarded appearances first, and that machine was relentless. Studios did not only produce films, they produced personal narratives. Fan magazines, gossip columns, church pressure, morality standards, and contract politics all pushed stars toward an acceptable public version of desire. A marriage like this could serve many purposes at once: respectability, publicity, insulation, and silence. That is what makes their chapter haunting. It is not the loudest scandal on this list. It is quieter than that. It feels like a marriage preserved in perfect lighting while something colder happened off camera. They divorced in the early 1950s, and what remained was not one explosive revelation, but the uneasy sense that Hollywood sometimes packaged emotional distance as romance. Cary Grant and Barbara Hutton. Cary Grant did not just look sophisticated, he looked untouchable. He moved through the screen with that impossible mix of wit, ease, and control, as if elegance itself had been taught to speak. Barbara Hutton came from another kind of spectacle, immense wealth, international attention, and a public life already treated like society theater. Put them together, and the image was irresistible. Their 1942 marriage gave Hollywood and the gossip press a dazzling headline. Grant, the immaculate leading man, had married one of the richest women in the world. The match radiated status. It also redirected attention. For years, Grant's private life had attracted speculation, especially because of his closeness to Randolph Scott and the fascination surrounding the two men living together earlier in the 1930s. None of that proves motive. But it explains why later, observers have read the Hutton marriage as strategic as well as romantic. That ambiguity is what makes this chapter effective in a story about Hollywood illusion. Maybe there was real affection. Some sources insist Grant cared deeply for Hutton and did not marry for money, yet the marriage also functioned as a shield, or at least as a glamorous distraction, in an era when a star's off-screen image had to remain legible to the public. And the public needed simple stories. Rich heiress, great movie star, beautiful wedding. That was easier to print than rumor, easier to sell than complexity, easier to believe than a private life that refused to stay inside studio expectations. The marriage lasted only a few years. The legend lasted much longer. Even after the divorce, people kept looking back at it as one of those perfect Hollywood unions that may have served purposes no wedding portrait could admit. That is the pattern here. Beauty in the foreground, pressure in the background, and Hollywood quietly steering attention away from whatever it feared most. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester bring a different feeling to this list. Less flash, less tabloid shine, more tenderness, or at least the possibility of it. Laughton was one of the most formidable actors of his time, a performer of enormous intelligence and emotional force. Lanchester had wit, originality, and mischief that made her unforgettable. Together, they looked less like a publicity fantasy and more like an unusual alliance. They married in 1929 and remained together for decades. That alone separates them from the shorter, more visibly brittle stories on this list. Later memoirs and biographies helped shape the widespread belief that theirs was an unconventional marriage built on companionship, mutual understanding, and public respectability rather than conventional romance. Lanchester herself later wrote openly about Laughton's homosexuality, though even around that history, biographers and friends have not agreed on every detail. What feels clear is the emotional texture. This was not simply a fake wedding staged for one newspaper cycle. If the marriage served as protection, it also seems to have become a real human bond with its own private rules. That matters. Not every so-called Lavender marriage was empty. Some became structures people lived inside with loyalty, compromise, sadness, and care. Hollywood still benefited, of course. A married actor fit public expectations better than a man shadowed by rumors. Respectability softened scrutiny. But this chapter hurts in a quieter way because it suggests survival could sometimes require inventing a form of marriage that was neither pure deception nor simple truth. That is why their story gives this video its softer layer. Beneath the gossip sits something more complicated. Two people creating a life that may not have matched the public script, yet may still have contained devotion. Hollywood built lies, yes, but sometimes people inside those lies built companionship too. Raymond Burr and Fabricated Wives. Raymond Burr's story feels less like one suspicious marriage and more like a whole emergency architecture of image control. On screen, he projected authority. He could be intimidating, commanding, even comforting in that stern way that later made Perry Mason and Ironside so durable. He looked like a man built for certainty. Off-screen, the public story around him became stranger. Over time, Burr reportedly circulated tragic accounts of wives who had died and even a child lost to catastrophe. Different versions appeared in profiles and interviews. The details shifted. That alone raises the alarm. Later biographers and researchers challenged those stories and argued that much of this family history had been fabricated or at least heavily embellished to support a heterosexual public image and cover what he did not feel safe revealing. That makes this one of the most shocking chapters here, because the performance did not stop at one wedding or one strategic date. It expanded into a whole mythology of grief. A dead wife, a dead child. The kind of sorrow nobody wants to interrogate too closely. In a culture obsessed with masculine credibility, tragic widowhood could function like a shield. It made questions seem cruel, and Hollywood understood the power of that. The safest image was not always the glamorous one. Sometimes it was the wounded, respectable one. Studios, publicists, and celebrity journalism all thrived on narrative simplicity, and Burr's alleged invented history offered exactly that. The emotional cost is almost hard to measure. Imagine having to build an imaginary domestic life just to keep the real one hidden. Burr later shared a long relationship with Robert Benavides, but for much of his peak fame, the public myth moved ahead of the private man. That is why this chapter lands so hard. Hollywood did not just sell romance. It could pressure people into manufacturing entire families that never existed. William Haines and Jimmy Shields. William Haines should have been one of the studio era's safest success stories. In the late silent era and early sound years, he was a major MGM star with charm, timing, and a modern, mischievous energy audiences loved. He did not project tragedy. He projected confidence. He looked like someone built to keep winning. Then, Hollywood demanded a lie, and Haines refused to tell it. By the early 1930s, his long relationship with Jimmy Shields was no secret inside parts of the industry. Accounts differ in wording, but the core story has been repeated for decades. After a scandal involving Haines and another man, MGM chief Louis B. Mayer reportedly pressured him to end his relationship and enter a sham marriage that would protect both his image and the studio. Haines would not do it. According to the most famous version of the story, he chose Jimmy Shields over stardom. That decision turned him into the anti-Lavender marriage chapter in this video. While others were pushed toward strategic weddings, Haines stepped away from the system rather than perform a straight life for the cameras. The price was enormous. His film career collapsed. The industry that had celebrated him moved on. But the emotional legacy is the opposite of collapse. Haines and Shields stayed together for decades and became one of the most enduring couples in old Hollywood social circles. Haines reinvented himself as a highly successful interior designer, serving elite clients who wanted his taste even after the studios no longer wanted his face on marquees. That is the twist that still stings. Hollywood could punish authenticity. It could sideline a bankable star because truth was considered worse than pretense. Yet Haines's refusal now looks almost radical in its clarity. He lost the fantasy, but kept the person who mattered. In a world where Hollywood built lies to protect careers, William Haines chose love and paid for it with fame. Van Johnson and Evie Wynn. Van Johnson was MGM's all-American answer to anxiety. He smiled like reassurance. He played servicemen, good guys, charming young heroes. During and after World War II, his image felt wholesome, in exactly the way the studio system prized most, which is why the story of his marriage to Evie Wynn has remained so troubling. Evie was the former wife of actor Wynn, and the personal connections around all three made the situation messy before the wedding even happened. Johnson married her in 1947, only hours after her divorce from Keenan became final, a detail so dramatic it almost sounds scripted. And that is precisely why later accounts have often treated the marriage as more than a romance. It has been described as a union encouraged, or at least welcomed, by a studio environment eager to stabilize Johnson's heterosexual image amid industry gossip. Again, certainty is dangerous here. The marriage was real, a child was born, the household existed, but real marriages can still be shaped by pressure, panic, and image management. That is what makes this story darker than a simple label can capture. The fallout reportedly spread through friendships and family life. Biographical accounts and later memoir material describe strain, jealousy, hurt, and the corrosive effects of secrecy. Instead of closing the rumor cycle neatly, the marriage seems to have deepened emotional damage around the people involved. The public saw a respectable star settling down. Private life appears to have been far more unsettled. And that is why this chapter belongs at the end. It feels like the wreckage left behind when Hollywood's control machine kept grinding long after the wedding photos were taken. Not every lie stayed polished. Some tore through real homes. Some damaged friendships. Some left everyone inside the arrangement lonelier than before. Old Hollywood sold romance beautifully, but behind some of its most elegant weddings was fear. Which Lavender marriage do you think caused the deepest emotional damage? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the bell for more untold stories.